Hello, summer school. It's great to be here. Greetings from New York. It's a great treat to be able to be part of this from across the ocean, which wouldn't ordinarily happen. And I'm very happy to be here with you today. And I'm here to talk to you about translation as storytelling. So translating, as I see it, is always a sort of storytelling. It's a way of giving an account of something you've read in another language, and now you're doing all the voices as you sit around the campfire. A literary translation, as I see it, is your account of what you found in something you've read. And this is structural, it's inevitable in literary translation of every sort, but it becomes doubly true in the case of retranslations, particularly in the retranslations of classic texts that already exist in several versions in the language in question. I've retranslated two classic texts before now, Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, Exhibit A, and Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, here. And in each case, I thought hard in advance about what sort of story I had to tell about these works, and in particular, what stories I thought previous translators had not managed to tell as I would. In the case of Siddhartha, my story had to do with a notion of a state of grace as expressed in extreme lyricism. Regardless of what you think of the profundity of Hesse's novel or lack thereof, Hesse was a very gifted writer, prose stylist. His sentences in German are almost aggressively melodic, even cloying in their lushness, heavy on the assonance and so forth. And in the case of his book, Siddhartha, I felt that this was work his prose needed to be doing to make the case for the vision of the world he was presenting to us in the immediate aftermath of what was at the time called the Great War, which had devastated Europe with unprecedented violence. This was a 20th century war fought with modern machinery, airplanes, tanks, bombs. It took the life of 8.5 million men across Europe, with a further 7.8 missing in action. And of the people who returned home from the war, many were physically and psychologically scarred. The word shell-shocked was coined in 1915. There's no contemporary German equivalents for that either. I looked. Kriegsneurose, or war neurosis, dates from half a century later. Kriegszitterer, war trembler, somebody who came back shaking, never made its way into the German dictionary. Does this have to do with the fact that there was so much shame and fury around this war in Germany that no one wanted to talk about it, much less see the wounded soldiers as victims? In any case, in English, we do. And this is where Siddhartha comes in. Hesse started writing this book in 1919 and finished it in 1922. So at a moment when the young men of Europe were maimed and dead, Hermann Hesse wrote a fantasy about a young man with all the time in the world to search for his true calling. And the prose that goes along with this project, excuse me, turning a page here, sentences with a flowing melody held together with assonance. This represents the state of nirvana in the book, the sense of a universe in balance. Everything is about the harmonious balance of the prose, the dignified pacing. And so this notion governed my approach to the translation. I was going to throw everything else out the window and think about how these sentences were sounding. So here's a glimpse at my translation. This scene is a turning point where Siddhartha decides to kill himself, deciding that his attempts at finding a good life are a failure. And then at that moment, he finds inspiration to turn his life around and seek enlightenment. So it's a crux. I'll read this. Above the riverbank, a tree grew aslant, a coconut palm. And against its trunk, Siddhartha rested his shoulder, placing his arm around the tree and gazing down into the green water that flowed on and on beneath him, gazed down and found himself utterly overwhelmed by the desire to let go and sink beneath its surface. A terrible emptiness was reflected back at him from beneath the water and found its reply in the awful emptiness within his soul. He had reached an impasse. All that was left for him to do now was annihilate himself, smash to pieces the botched structure of his life, throw it away, hurl it at the feet of the mocking gods. This was the great purging he had longed for, death, the smashing of the form he so despised. Let the fish devour him, this dog Siddhartha, this madman, this spoiled and rotten body, this sagging and abused soul. Let the fish and crocodiles devour him, let demons tear him to pieces. With a grimace, he peered into the water, saw his face mirrored there, and spat at it. Feeling profound weariness, he released his arm from around the tree trunk and rotated his body a little so as to let himself fall vertically, sink at last into the depths. With closed eyes, he sank towards death. Then, from distant reaches of his soul, from bygone realms of his weary life, a sound fluttered. So this is my sense of the sound quality of this passage. I snatched the word aslant from the Ophelia scene in Hamlet, which, you know, it's a drowning scene. It's a scene that I wanted to link to this one, but it's an invisible link because nobody but me will notice. Nobody knows about it except, you know, you guys now. Anyway, let's look at some other ways in which this scene could sound. I've showed you one sentence here from this passage in a number of translations. I'm not going to read them all. That will take too long, I think, but it's the sentence that I translated. All that was left for him to do now was annihilate himself, smash to pieces the botched structure of his life, throw it away, hurl it at the feet of the mocking gods. This was the purging he longed for, death, the smashing of the form he so despised. And you'll see there are a lot of differences of opinion of what these sentences are going to sound like in English. I mean, even if you just look at the word that I translated as purging, in German, das große Erbrechen. Erbrechen being a more formal word in German for vomiting. There's kotzen, speien. There's various more casual words, and Erbrechen is the formal word for it. I translated it as purging. We have emesis, the scientific word, vomiting, which would be, I guess, the default translation here. Retching, which is I like the choice retching also. Note that in the Hilde Rossner translation from 1951, the word is elided. That was a translation that I think was subjected to very heavy copy editing by the publisher. This is my guess about it. Because in the first line, the sal trees, a forest of sal trees, it's a kind of tree, was translated, it was turned into sallow wood, and that looks to me like an editor's choice rather than a translator's choice. So the takeaways here is always get last final edit on your translations. So the word was edited out, I think, of this passage. Okay, the last line of the book, Siddhartha. I wanted to hit home my point about the novel, my interpretation of it. So I rearranged things a little bit to come up with an ending that served my reading of the book, because I think that, you know, this sense of harmony, which is where the book is arriving at, you know, after all of Siddhartha's strivings, he reaches the point of peace, in which he disappears. And the last bit of the novel is from the point of view of his buddy Govinda, who's accompanying him and watching all this. And Govinda bows at the end. I'll read the German. Tief verneigte sich bis zur Erde vor dem regungslos Sitzenden, dessen Lächeln ihn an alles erinnerte, was in seinem Leben jemals geliebt hatte, was jemals in seinem Leben ihm wert und heilig gewesen war. There's a chiasmus in the German, you know, that figure of speech. beauty is truth, truth beauty, or fair is foul, foul and foul is fair. Here it's that in seinem Leben jemals or jemals in seinem Leben, where the two elements are presented in reversed order. I thought that in English that particular one wasn't going to work so nicely, so I used the repetition, everything that he had ever loved in all his life, everything that had ever in all his life been dear to him and holy. So I varied the word order within the all his life setup. No, I'm not describing that correctly. Everything that he had ever loved in all his life, everything that had ever in all his life. So there's a slight variation within the repetition. What I'm doing is trying to slow down the sentence to give it the gravitas it needs, which is why I doubled the word bowed, the verb. In German, it's deeply he bowed down to the earth. But because the German words have more syllables than these English words, in English, it tends to go too quickly. And so I repeated the verb deeply he bowed to the very earth, and added the word very to slow it down so that the sentence has the right rhythm. I also did not want the last words of my translation of this novel to be to him, which is why I did the little fiddling with the word order near the end, dear to him and holy. Otherwise it would have been dear and holy to him, which is clunky and awful. In German, the words end on had been, gewesen war, but these words are sort of invisible in German. You're left with the sense of wert, dear, and heilig, holy. Wert meaning dear and also valuable, but I think that's contained also in the English word dear. So I did a lot of manipulating to end on the word holy, because that's where I wanted to leave this book. So you see how my interpretation of what this book is doing is shaping the prose. Okay, let's move on. Kafka, the Metamorphosis. So for this book, the story that I wanted to tell is that Gregor Samsa of the Metamorphosis is a hysterical drama queen. The story is a comedy, admittedly a very, very black comedy, very dark. And the joke is always on Gregor. He's really a poor sap. Things happen to him because he's a fool. Kafka's humor is situational, it's deadpan, and the story's humor comes from the disconnect between Gregor's frantic attempts to do the right thing as a company man. He puts work above all else. Don't be like Gregor, or only enough to get your translations done on time. So there's a contrast between these frantic attempts he makes to do his job well and his grotesque physical state, because he's been changed into this monstrous creature. So he's a parody of the very notion of dutifulness as I see it. And it's made even funnier, though also even sadder, by the sense that we have that in some spiritual sense, he's brought down this curse upon himself by his own foolish obedience, which is extreme to the point of absurdity. You know, think about it. He wakes up to find that he's stuck in a different body, and half his thought processes are about worrying that he's going to be in trouble because he's going to be late for work. So his problem is, oh Lord, how do I get to work on time? This is funny. He's worrying about the wrong thing. In my opinion, the funniest part of the entire story is when the father pulls out a safe, opens it, and with the valuable family paperwork starts reviewing the family finances, and they discover that the family had plenty of money all along. And Gregor has been talking about how he has to work and has to work so hard to pull the family out of debt. Well, they never were in debt to begin with. Ha, 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 poor Gregor. So it's melodramatic, and that's humorous, and I worked to make the melodrama as clear and obvious as I can. You know, there's stories about Kafka rolling on the floor reading stuff aloud, and I'm sure he did that with this. So I looked for deadpan humor that I could find within overly formal language and precise enunciation to play off the contrast between Gregor's strange body and all his uber normal talking. So here's an example of that. Sollte ich jetzt weniger Feingefühl haben, dachte er, und saugte schon gierig an dem Käse. Might I be more fastidious than before? You know, this is, you have to raise your little pinky to read that. He thought, already sucking greedily at the cheese. And here's another example. Gregor realized that he could not, the general manager has come to check up on him to see why he's late for work, and then discovers that he's a monstrous creature and flees in horror. And Gregor is trying, in his monstrous body, is trying to stop him from leaving. Gregor realized that he could not possibly allow the general manager to depart in his present frame of mind if his own position at the firm was not to be put in the gravest jeopardy. Grave indeed. And here's one where I'm going to read you a bit of a scene where I controlled the pacing by, again, doubling the verb as I did in Siddhartha, because so many words are too short in English and scenes happen too fast. The scene was happening too fast, and I wanted to do something with a double entendre. So this is the end of the first of the book's 3 parts. I'm going to read a bit from here. The father, as you'll all recall, I'm sure you've read this book, has just chased Gregor into his room, this is a scene where he's chasing him into his room to get him out of the public space of the shared living room of the apartment. And it's high drama. Here we go. So the father's hissing and chasing him. Of course, in his father's current state, it could not possibly have occurred to him to open the door's other wing. It's a 2-wing door, and one is open, the other shut. To open the door's other wing to create an adequate passage. He was fixated on the notion that Gregor must disappear into his room as quickly as possible. Never would he have tolerated the complicated preparations necessary for Gregor to prop himself up so as possibly to pass through the door in an upright position. Instead, as though there were no obstacle at all, he now drove Gregor before him, raising a great din. What Gregor heard at his back no longer resembled the voice of merely a single father. It was do or die, and Gregor thrust himself, come what would, into the doorway. One side of his body tilted up, rising at an angle as he pressed forward, scraping his one flank raw and leaving ugly stains behind on the white door. And soon he was wedged tight, unable to move on his own. On one side, his little legs dangled trembling in midair, while on the other, they were crushed painfully beneath him. Then his father administered a powerful shove from behind, a genuinely liberating thrust that sent him flying, bleeding profusely, into the far reaches of his room. The door was banged shut with a stick, and then at last all was still. So here's the moment that you see on the screen. Then his father administered a powerful shove from behind, a genuinely liberating thrust. I translated the word stoß twice, once as shove, once as thrust. There's a sexual connotation to the word stoß, although it's also just the word for push, a good hard push. In the translation now, the word gets to be there in both these cases. Just thrust, I think, would have been too far in the one direction, and I wanted things to happen not too quickly so that this moment of his torment is shown to you in this protracted horror. Okay, so enough of that. That's my Kafka story. Now let's talk about The Magic Mountain. So, well, that's a truly monolithic work of German literature. It's big, if you drop this book on someone, you could hurt them. So, I'm very careful. It's a book that if you read in bed, be careful. If it falls on your nose, don't want to think about it. And I'm still in the early stages of translating this book. So it's going to take me a little while more to decide exactly what sort of story I'm telling with my translation of the book. It's a work in progress in all the senses. But one of the ideas I already have about it is that the book is one huge inflated fairy tale. As suggested by a remark in passing in the book's prologue, which I've translated it since it's at the beginning of the book, the last line, besides, it's not out of the question that this story of ours in its innermost nature will bear some resemblance to a fairy tale. And there's a number of points throughout the book where the language can reflect this reading. So to give you an example of that, one of the first translation problems in The Magic Mountain that I spent a few days puzzling over is the translation of the simple little word einfach, literally simple, that appears both in the first line of the prologue. You'll see the story of Hans Castorp, we mean to tell, not for his sake, for the reader will find him a simple, albeit agreeable young man. That simple is einfach. And it also appears in the first line of chapter 1 of the book, which follows soon thereafter. In both cases, the word einfach is used as part of the unit, ein einfacher junger Mensch, literally a simple young person or young man, young human being. Here's the beginning of chapter 1. And in my first draft, I wrote simple young person and then went on trying to find a better word to replace that simple with, since after all, surely the protagonist of Thomas Mann's great novel isn't a simpleton. I ticked through a number of possible synonyms like regular, ordinary. My partner even suggested the 21st century equivalent basic, as in a basic young person. And I settled on the word unremarkable, which I find a very appealing word that fits with the arched eyebrow. We're both in on the joke here, ironic tone that Mann is cultivating. But then I started thinking about it more. In what sense is young Hans Castorp unremarkable? He's not an average sort of person. I mean, the first thing we learn about him on this first page is that he's rich, or at least wealth adjacent. He's carrying a traveling bag fashioned of pricey and exotic crocodile skin that, as we are immediately informed at the bottom of this page, was given to him by a consul with a fancy sounding name who is both his uncle and foster father. Clearly his family story is anything but simple. Of course, the word might well be meant ironically, but does Mann really expect us to be reading in high gear irony mood already by the second word of chapter 1? Well, maybe he does. But I started to hunt around in period dictionaries. I love using dictionaries that were produced in the period when the work I was translated was written. So I have lots of early 20th century dictionaries, and they're very important, and you cannot find that stuff online. You have to find them and use bookstores and hoard them. That's just an aside. But I studied these dictionaries to see how the words einfach and simple were being used in the early 20th century when this book was written, and discovered that both words were often understood, i.e. the first subheading in their dictionary definitions, to mean guileless or artless, i.e. a person senza alcun sospetto in Dante's famously unsuspecting Paolo and Francesca, the ones who fell in love over a book without suspecting anything. In other words, innocence. And this makes sense here. Isn't Magic Mountain the story of an unsuspecting young person who got on a train to play a 3-week visit and got more than he bargained for? I really do think that this is the story Mann is telling. And then there's the bit in the prologue where the narrator coyly points out that there's something of the fairy tale in the book he's presenting. So what if the translation of einfach really were literally just simple? Don't many fairy tales start out with a simple young person setting out on a journey? And if the secondary meaning, not so clever, creeps in as well maybe it's not such a big deal. Continuing to ponder, I remembered Emily Wilson's brilliant analysis of the opening line of Homer's Odyssey that prompted her to describe Odysseus as a complicated man. She notes the etymological derivation of this English word from the Latin plicare, to fold. So Odysseus is both many-layered, think of a cloth folded over on itself, and the one who has journeyed hither and yon, many turnings in his past. He is pleated with pleats, the com and pli of complicated. And it turns out that the pla of simple comes from plicare as well. Sim signifies self-same, i.e. one. So the simple is that which has only a single turning or fold. technically you might object, the simple ought to be without folds, just as complicated as with them. Or to use a different sort of example, shouldn't that excellent product we refer to as 2-ply toilet paper actually be called 1-ply? Well, at a certain point, the word designated a fold came to mean a layer as well, making simple the clear opposite of complicated, which also makes it a not bad metaphorical equivalent for the German Einfach, which literally means one compartment. Fach is a compartment. I'm still at the beginning of my Magic Mountain explorations, but for now, I'm going to call the fellow a simple young man. When translating something that's been translated before, I usually avoid looking at the earlier translations or looking at them much, because I don't want them to, my reading of them, to interfere with the sound, with the idea about the book that I'm creating in my own head, my own story. But for purposes of this lecture, I went and looked at the 2 earlier translations of The Magic Mountain, one by Helen Lowe Porter from 1927. This is the translation that Mann knew about. He knew her, he approved it. In that book, the word is translated in 2 different ways, in the preface and in chapter 1. The first time as simple-minded, the second time as unassuming. She may well have translated them to match, and a copy editor changed it, or an editor changed it. This is always possible. And in the John E. Woods translation from 1995, it's translated the same way both times, because John knows that you need the final edit of your translations. So they are the same. And in both times, he uses the word ordinary, which is a word I also considered. So the book is differing already. The forking paths are beginning to fork already at the beginning of the book in these translations. Okay, there's a second area in which I'm looking to shape my translation, and that's through a really precise accounting of the details of the book's cultural artifacts. Now, the book's set in Switzerland, a place where I've spent a lot of time. As I've just finished writing a biography of Robert Walser, the great Swiss writer. I've translated 8 books by him. So that's going to be on my mind. But also, I'm the first person translating this book in the 21st century. And I have 21st century library access and also internet. Helen Lowe Porter had access to Mann himself, but I don't think he was interested in explaining every detail of every reference to her. That would have taken a long time in a 1,000-page book. And John Woods was translating before the internet started, in 1995, which means he turned in the manuscript in 1994. The internet was just, a fellow grad student of mine at Princeton uploading pictures to what was going to be the, Boston Fine Arts Museum website, one of the first websites to exist. The internet wasn't a place where you could go, dive deep and learn about all the weird details of everyday life from 100 years ago. So they're those things. And, because of my interest in Switzerland and the German-speaking Swiss context specifically, I'm going to approach the book the way an English speaker journeying to German-speaking Switzerland today might encounter things. So the Swiss canton where the book is set is going to be called Graubünden and not Grison, not the French name, but the German name for it. And, there's a waitress who the characters who are from Hamburg, from northern Germany, are chuckling over the fact that a waitress in German is called Saaltochter, or, literally hall daughter. It seems quaint and strange to the German visitors, and that name is going to be highlighted also in my book. One of the works I'm consulting here is a early 20th century Baedeker to see how things were talked about. So this is a book that's exceptionally full of details like this that need looking up. And since I have the luxury of working not on a tight deadline, which is because I have a day job, which is, makes it possible to translate in a different way than it is when you are making a living on translating and, you know, only really can afford to spend a certain amount of time on a book, which doesn't mean that it doesn't mean anything about the quality of the translations and the translators, but I'm taking advantage of this privilege I have through having a sort of income other than the book to spend infinite amounts of time looking things up. For example, I'm looking up a joke made by Hans Castorp's brother that involves something that's called in German a sterilette. It's also called in French a sterilette, which I spent a lot of time researching. It turns out to be an early 20th century precursor of the IUD, or intrauterine device, a birth control contraption. And the sterilette was talked about a lot less in the English-speaking internet than the German and French-speaking internets. So I had to do a lot of research before I discovered that this particular torture device is the thing known in English as a stem pessary. These are the devices on the top row that are inserted into the cervix to prevent contraception. They caused a lot of infections and other injuries in the early 20th century. This page is from a catalog of surgical instruments from 1915. It turns out that the great early 20th century feminist Margaret Sanger was a great supporter of pessaries as a form of birth control, because it's like set it and leave it. People used to go to the doctor and the doctor would insert it, and then you go back a month later and he'll clean it, and go back every month in the subscription. Anyway, but Margaret Sanger, I found pamphlets from this period that were distributed in the US in which she writes about the widespread use of these devices in Holland and England, just saying, and supports their becoming more available to women in the US because birth control was hard to get. Anyway, this device becomes the basis of a joke that's early in the Magic Mountain, and I'm going to read you this passage, and it's a joke because the word sterilette sounds a little like the word stiletto if you're a German speaker in the early 20th century where stiletto heels were not yet ubiquitous, and these are foreign words in German, and you happen to be a lady who makes a lot of malapropisms. Here's the passage. The brother, Hans Castorp's brother, the one who actually has consumption at the beginning of the book, he's gone to visit him. So Joachim, the brother, says that there was a lady who shared his table in the dining room named Frau Stör. She was quite seriously ill, by the way, a musician's wife from Cannstatt. She was the most uneducated creature he'd ever laid eyes on. She spoke in all seriousness of disinfectating a room and praised the resident Krakowski for his devotion to the Hippocratic oath. All of this must be swallowed without a hint of a grimace. On top of it, she was a horrendous gossip, which, by the way, was true of most people up here, remarking, for example, that Frau Iltes, was there really someone up here named Mrs. Ferret, wore a pessary to avoid getting knocked up. Just imagine, she goes around talking about pessaries, priceless. And half reclining over the backs of their chairs, they laughed so hard that their bodies shook, and they both began almost simultaneously to hiccup. All right, that's a little early scene from the Magic Mountain. I'm not going to be able to keep it as a pessary. I'm going to have to, because the stiletto, you don't get the malapropism. I'm going to have to come up with something better. But that is part of a work in progress here, discovering what the insider jokes were. I also spent some time looking at maps of the Hamburg Harbor, which was developed in the early 20th century, and the characters talk about the development of the Hamburg Harbor. So, you know, that's some fun research. There's some pictures of the Hamburg Harbor, but that's not so much a translation technical story, I think. So I'm going to leave you with this beautiful image of a sanatorium hotel in Davos, Switzerland, where the Magic Mountain is set, and I think that in a moment we'll have a chance to talk more in person or in Zoom person. about translation questions. I'm happy to answer any questions about any of these books I've translated or anything else around the profession.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our live Q&A with this evening's summer school lecturer, Susan Bernofsky, who joins us from the United States. Susan Bernofsky is Associate Professor of Writing at Columbia University in New York City, where she directs the Literary Translation Program. Her own literary translations include 8 works of fiction by the great Swiss-German modernist author Robert Walser, as well as novels and poetry by Jenny Erpenbeck and Yoko Tawada, by Franz Kafka, Hermann Hesse, and others. A Guggenheim Fellow and former chair of the Penn Translation Committee, she co-edited with Esther Allen the Columbia University Press anthology In Translation, Translators on Their Work and What It Means. Her translation of Jenny Erpenbeck's novel The End of Days won the 2015 Independent Foreign Fiction Prize, the Schlegeltick Translation Prize, the Unger Award for Literary Translation, and the Oxford Weidenfeld Translation Prize. Her translation of Yoko Tawada's novel Memoirs of a Polar Bear won the inaugural Warwick Prize for Women in Translation in 2016, and in 2018 she was awarded the MLA's Lois Roth Award for her translation of Erpenbeck's Go Went Gone. As we heard in her lecture, she's just completed work on a biography of Robert Walser, which will be published by Yale University Press in spring 2021. And she's currently working on a new translation of Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. Susan blogs about translation at translationista.com. Welcome, Susan. It's lovely to have you join us.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak. It's lovely to be able to participate, even though I cannot obviously travel physically to the UK right now. I'm very, very happy to be able to be with you in this way.
So, as people think about their questions, perhaps I can begin by asking you, Susan. Firstly, thank you so much for that wonderful lecture on translation as storytelling. And I was just wondering, to start off with, perhaps in your view, should it always be possible to translate in a way that tells a story, as you describe, reflecting a strong critical interpretation? Or does this perhaps depend on the nature of the text, the character of the translator, and so on?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a very important question. And I think about this kind of approach to translation specifically in connection with the classics. Is my sound good?
Yes.
By the way, yeah. Because these are texts that exist in more than one translation. And so, it makes sense that the different translations should differentiate themselves from one another in this way. On the other hand, I don't think it's possible to do a neutral translation of anything. We may fool ourselves into thinking that we are completely neutral and free of subjectivity as readers, as thinkers, as human beings, but of course we're not. Even though all of us are, I think, used to seeing our own points of view as default. But I think it's an interesting exercise, no matter what it is you're translating, to think about, what is the position of your subjectivity? How do you position yourself culturally, linguistically, aesthetically, emotionally, vis-a-vis the text you're translating? And in a lot of cases, if it's a contemporary text, if it's a text with a strong point of view, maybe you want to think, how much can I get out of the way? What are ways in which I might be tempted to push this text without even thinking about it? And can I not do that? But some authors I translate actually, like Yoko Tawada particularly, very much wants her translator's point of view to be part of the story that she's telling in the translation language. And so, when I talk with her about translating her work, she very much encourages me to be playful with the translation, to, what are ways that I could play in English that, maybe didn't work in German. In her story, Where Europe Begins, for example, I don't know if you know that story, but it's a travelogue story. It's a fairy tale rife journey. And at the end of the story, there's a sort of alphabet soup in which all these important elements and people and figures and metaphors from the story recur with their initial letters, and the letters spell out a word. And, you know, the things that begin with these letters are different in different languages. And, you know, I had conversations with her about, you know, which English words I was going to be introducing into the story in order to make the alphabet soup work out properly.
Yes.
And she was very excited to have, you know, new vocabulary items that sort of tangentially related to what was happening thematically in the story. And, you know, that's a collaborative exercise. I mean, if you see the translation of The Story of My Teeth by Valeria Luiselli, Christina McSweeney has done her own new chapter, as it were, you know, collaboratively with the author at the end of the book, a sort of glossary. And, you know, so there's all kinds of spaces for explicit collaboration, but I think that even if we're not thinking about doing it explicitly, we can't help doing it to a certain extent implicitly. And it's, I think, better to be aware of that rather than to be in denial about your own subjectivity when you translate.
Right, right, yes, thank you. A question from Carrie Dixon: do you initiate your retranslations of classics, or are you asked to do it?
I have never reinitiated one. In fact, you know, I kind of think that all the classics are over-translated anyway. I don't know why we're doing so many translations of the classics. For publishers, I think the question is also often an economic one. Classics are perennial, you know, steady sellers. And, you know, in the case of Magic Mountain, I think that there are 2 excellent translations of this book already available in English. I admire Johnny Woods' translation very much. And I also admire the Helen Lowe Porter translation, which, you know, you could read about in Kate Briggs's This Little Art if you haven't read it directly. I think both of them are very fine work. And I don't think that the book needed retranslation, but my editor at Norton called up one day and said, so, you know, the folks from upstairs, i.e. the business people who work for the publishing house, decided that we should do a new Magic Mountain and we'd like you to do it. Will you do it? And I said, okay, you know, which other book could we do instead of this? You know, some Thomas Mann novel that hasn't been so already twice translated. And they said, no, this is not anything negotiable. This is the book that we are 100% doing. It's just the question of, do you want to do it or are we asking someone else? And I said, you know what, I would love to translate this book, so sign me up. And that kind of is what happened with Kafka. And it's also what happened when I did Siddhartha, the Hermann Hesse novel, both times. And I think that the reason that we have so many translations of the classics is just largely, ridiculously, an economic question. And in a sense, it doesn't hurt anything, but on the other side, the other hand, it does hurt something because perhaps these books are translated instead of other books that have never been translated. And, you know, certainly there are other modernist works from German that haven't been translated yet that should be, yes, etc. But it is interesting because classics tend to be translated plural times. You then have the opportunity to compare the translations, which is always very interesting because, you know, it's a great way to see the differential and translated point of view and sensibility, all those things. They're good study objects.
And classics can be created as well. I mean, through your own translations of Robert Walser, you've created Walser as a classic to English language readers.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think of Christopher Middleton as creating him as a classic, but, you know, yeah. I mean, I'm so happy that Walser has gone from someone who was not well known to now fairly well known because he's just such an amazing writer. And I'm very, very thrilled that he's getting more readers now.
A kind of follow-up question really from Winnie Smith on the question of translating classics. You mentioned Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. What similarities or differences do you see between working on classic texts in living languages and classic texts in historical ones?
Oh, that is such an interesting question. You know, it's interesting because, you know, I'm working on Thomas Mann now, and I find myself doing historical research of a sort that I might have done if I were translating a work from a no longer actively used language. I hate the expression dead language, but, you know, what does it mean for languages to die? You know, and if they run out of speakers, there are so many, you know, languages that are spoken today that won't be spoken in 3 years because, anyway, that's a whole other story. But I found so many things in Thomas Mann that German speakers today no longer know what they are. Like, you know, I was wrestling with a malapropism in the first chapter. There's a lady who's Frau Stör, who misspeaks repeatedly, and she misspeaks the word stiletto, which to her, at the time of the novel, it did not yet have anything to do with shoes. It was just a little dagger, and it's an Italian word in German, so exotic to this, you know, petty bourgeois woman from Swabia, from southern Germany. You know, she's provincial, and the joke's always on her, which is, it's kind of mean. But anyway, she makes a mistake and confuses the word stiletto with sterilette, which is, at the time, as I now, you know, find out the research, I think I said this in the lecture, you know, an early IUD. And so I'm doing research, but this is things where if I asked a current German speaker, what's a sterilette, I would probably get a blank look. You know, forgotten language. And like Hermann Hesse, for example, Hesse is somebody who became a very popular author among young people in the US, maybe also the UK in the 1960s and 70s. He was very widely read in English by young people. In Germany, not so much. And the reason is that Hesse's language in German reads as very old-fashioned now, and young people associate it as the way their grandma might talk when she was trying to sound extra fancy, you know. And so the language has dated much more quickly somehow in German than it does in the successive translations. And, you know, do translations date as quickly as their originals? I mean, I think people talk a lot about having to retranslate books because of the translation dates, but even if you read an older translation, you know, I'm blanking on the first translator, Hesse's first translator. I'll remember her name in a moment. But even her translation, which is quite old now, does not seem that dated to me, really. Hilde Rossner, it doesn't seem that dated to me. But Hesse himself reads as very dated to young German native speakers now.
Yes.
For better, for worse.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, thinking about then and it was clear from your lecture, the amount of research that you undertake for your translations. You were talking about using historical dictionaries and so on. I was wondering whether you're also reading secondary criticism around these authors, particularly the classical, the classics, the canonical writers, in order to formulate the strong interpretation, the story that you're telling through your translation. And I wonder if I could tag on to that a question from Jenny Watson. Do you think studying translation theory is important for a literary translator? So about research and preparation.
I guess I can't take a pass on both these questions. And so I'm obliged to answer them. And so I'm going to open my mouth and say things that are going to get me in big trouble in both the Germanistic world and the translation community. Oh, no. Thank you for ending my career right here on live TV. So typically, if I'm translating a classic work and there's a lot of literary criticism, I gather it and I bring it all, and it's sitting on a shelf in my study to be looked at as I work. And I usually wind up trying to look up things if I have specific questions, and I always mean to read all of it. And I usually don't get around to reading very much of it. I think it is useful, but I also think that as a translator, you notice different sorts of problems than literary scholars do. You know, I was speaking with a colleague, you know, when the sterilette question came up, the first thing I did was ask my pal, who's a, you know, a German professor who, you know, teaches Thomas Mann and, you know, knows all this stuff. And they were like, don't know what that is. You know, the literary critic interpreting the novel sees something unfamiliar and it's like, well, that's not part of what I'm doing here anyway, so who cares? Or not who cares, but I don't, you know, I'm not going to spend 3 days researching it like Susan did because it's not necessary. But I think that reading literary criticism is very useful because it can help give you ideas about what other very careful readers of the work see in the work that can, in fact, help shape your ideas. And I encourage you all to read a lot more of it than I do. As to literary theory, you know,
translation theory.
Translation theory. So I have a previous life as a translation theory scholar, you know, back in the 1990s when I was writing my dissertation on literary theory, specifically in the German-speaking universe. At the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, I was very interested in the German Romantics and the translation theory that they were writing, both explicitly and implicitly in their essays about other things where there'd be remarks about translation. And I studied the ideas that they were developing, you know, which if you just read one piece of this, it's Schleiermacher's essay on the different methods of translating. In a sense, you know, that is, for me, the classic work of that period. But I was comparing that with the actual translations that they were doing at the time and found that it didn't actually match up very well at all. And what they said they were interested in doing, they didn't really do. And in fact, some of them, like August Wilhelm Schlegel, who I wrote about a lot, even criticized other translators for doing that. For example, there was this dude, Johann Heinrich Voss with a V, V-O-S-S, who was a very prolific translator of the classics, Odyssey, Iliad. You know, he was the Emily Wilson of the late 18th century, except he wasn't as good. He had a very strong point of view, and he believed that you should show the meter of the original and get a sense of the way the language works in the original. All the things that Schleiermacher says, and that we can, you know, that through foreignizing, you know, we can follow the thread through to the early 20th century through the work of Lawrence Venuti, which I was very influenced by. And that is all an incredibly interesting lens to look at translation through, because talking about these ideas helps you, I think, get a grip on the same thing that I described 20 minutes ago in terms of understanding your own subjectivity vis-a-vis the translation. It's a different way of looking at that same question. And, you know, how is it that I can show things about the original that are maybe not as affected by my filtering? And, you know, these ideas are, I think it's incredibly useful for translators to think about these ideas. I don't know that when I'm sitting down at my desk working on the translation, that I make decisions based on that. In fact, I most certainly do not, but I think thinking about these ideas a lot and debating them and writing about them in an earlier phase of my life shaped the way I shaped my more holistic approach. You know, we talk about translating in this instinctual sense, but, you know, your instinct you develop through education and life experience and work experience. And so I think translation theory is useful and interesting, and it's its own, you know, branch of literary theory, which is, you know, a useful, interesting, worthwhile, you know, way to get into thinking about what literature is and, you know, how it works, what it does, what we want it to do. So I'm all for having lots of translation theory, and I read it. I don't teach it anymore. Although sometimes when I teach translation workshops, I do bring in, you know, smatterings just to make sure that my students are know that these ideas exist and begin to think about them, and can then go off and read more if they want. But it's not what I focus my classes on. But I think it's really good for translators, especially earlier on in their careers, to consider these different sets of ideas about what it is we do when we translate.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Slight change of direction with a question from Rachel Dorm. She says, "I love the specific examples in your talk of how you bring humor through in translation. No easy feat. You also speak with such good humor about your process. Do you have a base theory for how you approach translating humor, and how do you see humor inform the translation process?" So to sum up, do you translate humorously?
That's a hilarious question. That is so funny, because I'm a person who in my own life have trouble being funny. I mean, I'm surrounded by people who are very funny. My little sister is like the funniest person I ever met. Like, the entire time that we have any conversation, I'm always in stitches because she's so funny. And I find it really difficult to write humorously myself. And I find it easier to bring humor into translation than it's something I myself am writing. I'm not really a very funny person, even though I would like to be. You know, I aspire to be funny in a later life, but I've translated so many authors who are so funny. You know, Robert Walser is hilarious, and Kafka is so funny, and he's mean funny. And mean funny, that's an easier kind of funny, like snark. I think snark is easier than other sorts of humor. And I don't start asking me about all the different kinds of humor, because I don't know. I'm not good at funny. But snark is funny, and I think that Kafka's Metamorphosis is a deeply snarky work, and The Magic Mountain was kind of snarky too. And so that sort of humor, it's humor at somebody else's expense, which is not nice. Like the lady, you know, the lady who always misspeaks. I'm playing with all the funny, dumb things she might be able to say, and that's funny. Like, I've spent days thinking about, like, how could she make a mistake with stiletto in English? And the funny thing about knowing that it's a sterilet is that makes it unsavory. It has to do with birth control, so that's an unsavory topic. Especially, you know, now it's, you know, 100 years ago. Are you kidding? You know, people didn't talk about that. It was shameful. So that makes it funny. She out of embarrassment inadvertently says something really embarrassing. So we're making fun of her. Yeah, I'm playing around, since stiletto is not going to work for me, I don't think. I'm playing around with words for switchblade. So right now, the thing in my translation is a snatch blade. I don't know if that's going to stick, but, you know, she's making a mistake that's off color.
Mm-hmm.
It was better in the original. I might find something funnier. I hope I still do, but that's where we're at.
I was thinking in your lecture, when you talk about bringing out, as you say, the snarky humor in Kafka through your translation, and I was thinking there's a side to that which is very high risk, of course, because you risk alienating readers who perhaps don't share that view. So you're aiming through your translation to persuade readers who might perhaps have had a different view of Kafka that yours is.
You mean the sad, tragic Kafka? Are you talking about are you talking about the tragic demise of sad, tragic Kafka?
I suppose I am. Yes, I'm not saying that I espoused any of these views myself, but I'm just thinking that potentially then your translation is not for everybody. Is not going to be for everybody, or do you see it differently?
Yeah. I'm sure there is somebody who reads my translation and finds it flippant. You know, the person who's in love with the idea of sad, tragic Kafka might find it flippant. But I think they're wrong, you know. I mean, there's stories about Kafka himself rolling on the floor, reading stuff aloud. There's stories about him reading Robert Walser and cracking up. There's stories that he made Max Brod listen to several times in a row as he read them over and over, cracking up. I mean, I'm hoping to convince people by making the work appealing while also funny. Yeah, I don't know. You know, I actually don't really, I don't think that much about the reader.
Okay.
I think about my editors a lot, because editors are always like making me change. Like, here's a funny story. I have an actually funny story for you about Kafka. So, you know, Gregor Samsa has made this picture frame of sex woman. I mean, oops, lady in the fur coat. And he's carved this elaborate wooden frame with a, oh shoot, what's it called? It's a fret saw. He's carved this thing with a fret saw. And what a fret saw is it's a tiny kind of jigsaw, which he keeps in a drawer in his bedroom. And an editor who was looking at this text said, I don't know what a fret saw is. Can we make it some different kind of saw? How about a band saw? And if you know what a band saw is, you're cracking up very heavily now, because a band saw is a very large piece of equipment that comes with its own table mount. It's so large it has to be on a podium. It's certainly not in Gregor Samsa's, you know, drawer with his underwear. And then I realized, okay, so the problem is that I used a word that the editor doesn't know and is not willing to accept their non-knowledge of. And I realized that the mistake I had made with this word was not selling it well enough. You know, Kafka uses it as in a kind of compound, my blah, blah with his fret saw projects. And I unpacked that a little bit more. And now it's something like woodworking projects he does with his fret saw. Or I took the bite-sized morsels and put them in the right row on the plate, and the editor didn't notice the word anymore. And I'm like, okay, done. So I guess I'm thinking about a reader then.
That's a great
yeah, sometimes you have to sell the stuff in a different way than the original writer did, because the words are, an unfamiliar word is gonna, depending on how you place it in a sense, it might seem impenetrable, or it might seem like, oh, it's a kind of saw, I don't know what kind of saw, maybe I should Google it, or it's a kind of saw, we're good, and move on.
Yes. I have a couple of perhaps related questions, really, about the literary translation profession. Question from JB Her, in an old post on your blog meant for emerging translators, you seemed a bit reluctant to recommend literary translation as a career.
I got so slammed for that. Yes, all my professional translator friends is, what's wrong with you? We live by doing this.
And perhaps a related question from Paul Russell Garrett. You mentioned during your talk that you were lucky to have a day job, enabling you to spend more time on your translation. What about those of us who try to eke out a living as full-time literary translators? I
mean, I will say in my own defense that I also spent years doing that. And it meant that I was like working 80 hours a week and never slept and never had any fun, except translating is fun. I think that some translators are a lot faster than I am. I am a really, really, really slow translator, and I don't know why that is, but I go over everything so many times. And I think maybe it's because I'm not decisive enough. And I think to survive as somebody who's living on translation, you have to develop more skills about getting decisive faster than I do. If I had not been able to find another day job, I mean, I started my translation life with a day job. And so I already developed these bad habits of dawdling while translating. And then when I was doing it for full time, it was a struggle to translate fast enough to pay the bills. And I struggled with that so much. But it takes me longer than most people, I think, to get satisfied with something. That may just be it. By all means, you can make a career as a translator. I know all kinds of people who do that. I should never have written that on the blog. I thought of taking that down, you know, because you can edit, you can retroactively edit blog posts, as you know, I'm sure. But I decided to be honest and leave that up there so that everybody can just hate me for the rest of time, because it's true. You know, it's a moment when I was not acknowledging my own subjectivity, in fact, around this profession.
Charlie Kuhn, thinking about taking time to produce your translations, Charlie asks, how long have you got to complete the translation of The Magic Mountain?
My deadline was 2018. How much longer do you think I have?
Okay.
I'm in so much trouble. It took me longer to complete the Walser biography than I thought. And then the Walser biography came back from editing last October, and I had submitted 200,000 words, which is like 700 manuscript pages, and I cut it down to under 500. And that I spent an unplanned 9 months doing that. I am so late. My editor is now expecting it in 2 years, which if I work very hard, I think is actually possible, but it will be tight. So I'm expecting to spend 2 years completing it, working at a pretty hefty clip. It's a big book.
JB says, thank you, Susan. I didn't find your response offensive or anything myself. I thought it was refreshingly honest. And I'm thinking it is already, it's just gone 8:15 here in the UK. And I think on the note of refreshingly honest, I think that's a great way to end, actually, because I think that characterizes the whole session. It's been an absolute delight talking with you, Susan. Thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. Thank you for your generous responses to everyone's questions. Thank you to everyone for those questions. They've been really interesting questions. And
agreed. Thank you. Thanks for making me think and squirm a little. This was good.
So it only remains for me to thank once again, thanks Susan for being with us and for your generous responses to our questions, and to everyone participating, have a lovely evening, or depending on the time it is with you, have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody. Thank you.